Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everybody. My name is Eli Fishpaw, facilitator for the Rockbridge Conservation Seminar Series. Tonight, Leslie Sturges, president of Bat Conservation and Rescue of Virginia, will be presenting. Before I get to Leslie's talk, I want to inform you of other upcoming RAC seminars. All seminars are at 7 p.m. December 15th, this time on a Thursday, we will be exploring the potential of returnable restaurant container carryout containers to reduce the use of disposable plastic and paper residue, which is such a threat to our marine ecology when it becomes litter. Ellie Moss from an organization called Perpetual, a nonprofit promoting the transition from disposable to reusable containers, will describe the potential and challenges for creating an open loop returnable container restaurant carryout system. Perpetual promotes the concept of a circular economy where the residue of one process is the food for another process, where waste is prevented. Yes, and January 18th of 2023, another year starting, we will be learning about the impact of invasive species in the Rockbridge area with an emphasis on kudzu. Jared Lee, Virginia University Biology Program Coordinator, will present the hazards of local invasive species and how we might mitigate that threat. And then on February 15th, Sarah Coffey will be describing her work to create riparian buffers in our area. Working as part of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, she helped negotiate agreements for grant recipients with waterfront property owners to hire contractors to restore riparian buffers, plant trees. She is the recipient of the RAC's 2022 Conservation Impact Award. So look forward to that. But tonight, Leslie Sturges is an experienced presenter on the subject of bats in Virginia. Leslie will facilitate an in-depth discussion of Virginia's native bats and the conservation challenges our bats face. She will give a brief review of bats' natural history, discuss regional species, touch on local conservation issues and how to address them. Thank you, Leslie, for your willingness to share your passion for protecting this natural part of our rich, diverse ecology that we're all blessed to live in. Leslie is going to present uninterrupted for an hour and 10 or 15 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes.
All of a sudden it clicked up with another one. So then,
I got two of them going?
yeah, and so then we were getting this.
So Leslie has told us she needs that time for the content. I know I will know more about in an hour than I know now. If you come up with questions, enter them into the chat. Barbara Walsh will be monitoring the chat. Leslie?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to present this. I'm going to turn off my video of me, so you don't have to look at me in a tiny little square, and you'll be able to see the things. I do want to make one small just point, is that we have 17 species of bats in Virginia. I am not going to go over species by species because nobody ever remembers that. But I will give you resources as to where to go find more information on the individual species. And with that, let's learn about bats. And let me figure out how to get out of this screen so I can turn off my video. She says, I know how to do this. I've done this before. Okay, so bats, natural history and conservation in Virginia. There we go. Thank you. So we need to start with the basics when we're talking about bats, because I find that a lot of people tend to not understand that bats are not a monolithic group. You see movies called Bats, and you see newspaper articles, and the topic is bats. But what gets completely overlooked is that not all bats are the same. So this is a group of mammals. They're the only flighted mammals. They are the second largest group of mammals on the planet. There are now 1,400 species described, and there's about 5,000 species of mammals. So we're talking about 20% of all mammalian species are some kind of a bat. And with that huge diversity of species, there's a lot of strategies that they employ to get through life. So feeding strategies alone, you've got carnivores, you've got insectivores, you've got sanguivores, you've got frugivores, you've got nectarivores, you have pescivores, and I don't even know what you call a frog-eating bat. But, you know, there's just a lot of diversity there in the group. And there's also diversity in size and diversity in how they go about a year in their lives. So we are going to focus here on native insectivores. All of the bats in Virginia are insectivorous. We don't have pollinators. We don't have vampire bats. So it makes it a little easier to talk about them. But we have about, like I said, about 17 species. And even in that smaller grouping, there's a wide variety of roost habits. And one of the things that makes bats really fascinating to me is they are, I just love this term. I'm sure it's in favor for something even more cool, but heterothermic endotherms, which basically means like all mammals, they are warm-blooded, they're endotherms, they have an internal metabolism. But with bats, that shifts dramatically throughout a 24-hour cycle or throughout a season. So that's really kind of cool. They are by and large small. Flight with a mammalian flight drives a smaller size. So even though they're small, they break all the small mammal rules. So if we look at these small little fluttering beasts, relative to body size, they are the most long-lived mammal described. So for instance, this picture here is a Brandt's bat, which is a European species of Myotis. And a band recapture of one was 41 years old, healthy and on the landscape. There was a little brown bat captured with a band, and that one was aged at 34 years. And since that one, I think there have been a few others. So these guys live a long time. And just for a local story, we were lucky enough to host a small-footed bat that came from the natural bridge study population. And that guy, oh, now I'm blanking on, it was years old. It wasn't a little baby or anything, but the band recapture suggested that he was a number of years old, and he was captured with a recapture. He was actually injured when he was found, but he was very close to his original capture site. So these guys live a long time, but they're kind of homebodies if they're not migrating from place to place over a season. That said, they are highly mobile. So if you think about the freetails that are exiting the Bracken Cave in Texas or coming out of the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, those guys can be foraging up to 40 miles a night. And our big brown bat, which everybody, that's like the real home body of bats, they can forage up to 5 miles a night. So they move around a lot for such a small animal. They inhabit more space than a small mammal like that would suggest. And even though they're small and they have a super fast metabolism like all the other little mammals do, they only have a small litter, if you want to call it that. They usually only have 1 or 2 pups. There's a few outliers, but most of them have only 1 or 2 pups a year. So they're not like mice where they're having litter after litter after litter and able to fill any available space and turn over really quickly. I mean, what's the live fast, die young, have lots of babies is sort of the small mammal model, but these guys don't follow that. And unlike, say, a mouse that'll live in a small area for its entire life, bats often don't. Well, our bats often don't. They may be moving across the landscape depending on what their seasonal needs are. So getting back to the fact they're mammals that fly, you can find the image on the left just about anywhere. It makes the rounds all the time, but it's a really nice image to show the similarities between the human arm structure and the bats. And then you have the bird there in the middle. And what you can see is that bats have extremely elongated phalanges and metacarpals. So the phalanges are your fingers and the metacarpal are the bones that are inside the palm of your hand. So if you think about that, that long series of bones there, but the bat fingers are. So it's these elongated fingers that are sort of the struts of the wing. But it's not just that, because the arm is also involved in this lovely airfoil that's formed by the membrane. And that membrane is pretty amazing stuff. It can get holed, it can get torn, but it'll heal. It takes time, and they need to be safe and have enough to eat while that's happening. But they can actually fly with some pretty serious holes in their wings. So it's really neat stuff. It heals really quickly, relatively, to like sort of the size of the hole you see. Given enough food and safety from predators, it just goes and heals up. So it's really amazing. It's highly innervated, and it's also got a lot of capillary action in there. So it's blood infused, and there's actually tiny little hairs on the surfaces that apparently allow them to sense changes in airflow and air currents. So they're really good at flying. They're very flexible flyers, because in that whole structure of the fingers and the arm, and then the legs and the tail down in the uropatagium, all of that moves and bends, and that allows for really flexible flight. They're not very good at gliding, these little guys, but they definitely are highly agile and can maneuver in some really tight places where birds cannot. So for our local guys, rather than talk about each and every species, I kind of clump them into groupings. These are sort of shorthands that you'll hear when people who study bats talk about them. They also use these sort of general groupings. And the first thing is solitary versus colonial. So there are bats that live somewhat solitary lives. And then there are probably the better known bats that form colonies, and those are usually inside some sort of a structure. And we know them better because some of them have taken up residence in things like barns and attics and behind shutters and soffits and warehouses and all that, So these are sort of, you can also call some of them building bats, because buildings do an awful lot of, or they kind of mimic what a dead tree might provide for these colonial bats that use crevices. So we call them crevice bats, we call them colonial bats. But they are going to be sort of a dark brown or darker colors, because that's great camouflage if you're living in a nice dark crevice. Whereas your tree bats, you're going to see brighter colors. You're going to maybe even see multiple colors to break up outlines, because they're dealing with life out there in the foliage. And these are not as well-known bats because people don't encounter them nearly as often. But both groups exist in Virginia. So these solitary bats are only solitary for females when they're not raising their pups. So they do live in small family groups during pupping season, and then they disperse towards late summer and into fall, and then they're migratory. So these guys can be, especially this time of year, they can be coming from the north or a part of the resident population, or just stopping here on their way south. So these guys move quite a bit during migration season, but they're fluffy. These are super fluffy bats, because again, they're dealing with life out there in foliage and twigs, and some of their strategies for getting through rough weather are to either, like I've seen them in pouring rain, and they'll hang by 1 foot, and they just sort of get longer and longer and longer. And that allows the rain to just sort of cascade off of them. They will be in clumps of leaves where they're getting some protection from the elements. And in really cold times, they use clumps of leaves, either that are like remnant clumps that are on, in the trees. Like right now, if you go out, you'll find clumps of oak leaves that haven't left or haven't dropped from the tree yet. They'll use those. And if it gets really cold, they'll drop down into leaf litter and use the leaf litter as protection during severely cold weather. So I would like to put a myth to bed right here and right now. These bats can take off from the ground. You hear over and over and over again that bats cannot take off from the ground. That cannot be true, because if it were true, we would have no bats. They have to be able to rescue themselves if they get to the ground. They may need more forward area to do it than birds do, but red bats coming up out of leaf litter just kind of shoot up off the ground. It's amazing. So they are able to rescue themselves from the ground. So, and when I say rescue, a lot of times when they go to ground, it's because they're avoiding a predator or avoiding somebody they just would prefer not to have contact with at the moment. So this idea that bats cannot fly from the ground just doesn't, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes no sense whatsoever. So anyway, lovely fluffy bats that live out in the foliage and use leaf litter. Going back to our colonial/crevice bats, this bat box is a perfect example of how they like to live. They are in contact with each other. They cluster together both for warmth, and also so they can drop into torpor during the day to conserve energy, but the clustering helps maintain body temperature without them having to use their own metabolisms. I hope that makes sense, but it's a way of conserving energy. These guys are hugely, they're just constantly burning all the time unless they drop into torpor because of the small size. This clustering, the colonialism with some of these guys can get really, really complicated. There's this fission fusion model, which basically there's a lot of bats living in a area, and that's what's called a meta colony. And then in that colony, there are subgroups. And there is some movement of the population between and among subgroups. And those subgroups have been found preferentially roosting together, even though they are not related. So it implies that there are some social relationships going on there that are not kin-based. And that's really interesting for a lot of animals. There are some other animals that are really well known for using this sort of model, and that is crows. The corvids do it all the time. We know that they leave their preferred group and go back and visit, their mom or whatever. So there's a lot of social interactions that are going on between groups, and that helps with social cohesion. And it also helps if something happens to your roost and you need to move, you're not competing with the other groups in the area because you all know each other already. Another interesting animal that uses that sort of model is humans. So if you think about it, we do that too, and it's actually a really good strategy for dealing with things out on the landscape where your tree might fall down or anymore now, the barn's getting taken down or whatever. The other really interesting thing to me about bats is these colonial bats here is that they have what it's called site fidelity. So wherever they're living is where they're living. So the roost that they're using is known to them, and it can be used over and over and over. There are historic records of some bat colonies going back over 100 years. So you can't just take a bat and take it somewhere and let it go, because it knows where it came from and it's going to try to go back. Obviously, if you're living in a big colony and you have to know everybody who's in the area, you have very high social intelligence. So these guys interact with each other. In some species, there are suggestions of dialects and syntaxes and self-identification. So they're doing all kinds of stuff through communication, and some of it in ultrasound, some of it not. But to me, they seem to be pretty advanced little critters. And I don't know the size of everyone's screen, but if you look at the image there, you can see all those big brown bats there. They've got nice dark bald muzzles, and they've got that lovely fur. And then on the bottom row, the two leftmost, you see the leftmost bat, the one immediately to the right of that is not a big brown bat. That is a freetail. And so this is an image of what we call a mixed species colony, and it appears that freetails are moving into Virginia and that they are being mixed in with big brown colonies. So I think that's pretty neat too. Now, freetails are the ones that live in these enormous colonies in the Southeast and Central South. So I'm not real excited about a species that may be forming colonies into the thousands because I just don't want to deal with those phone calls, but they're really cool bats. And then we have this other very small group of bats that kind of do a little bit of both. They they're referred to as semi-solitary tree bats, and the one on top, the two on the top are actually silverhair bats. And those are, the people refer to them as solitary, but those two came out of a tree hollow that someone was having a tree taken down, and they were in there together. So I'm not so sure that they're all that solitary. And those two happen to be females, and they had pups, and they kind of raised them together. So I think we tend to categorize bats because we don't really know a whole lot about what they're doing out there. So there's a lot left to learn about these guys. But the ones on the bottom are tricolored bats, and they form smaller colonies, but they're still forming maternity colonies. I should say about the colonies, by and large, the colonies we're talking about are what we call maternity colonies. And those are reproductive females who are rearing their young together. The freetails seem to have males mixed in the colony, but most of our species, if they're forming colonies, it's going to be primarily females and their young. But anyway, these guys do not use, they don't form big colonies, so they're not in the barns, they're not in the attics. They use different, like tree hollows, sloughing bark, those sorts of things. So you don't encounter these guys very often. The silverhairs, I find people mostly encounter them because they will use wood piles for hibernation in the winter. So I probably a few times a year, I get phone calls from people who all of a sudden have a bat in the house, or they, and it's in the middle of winter, or they went and rented a cabin out in the park somewhere. And I just say, did you bring firewood in recently? And yeah, so they come in on firewood. So if you've got a wood stove, please, in the winter, put your gloves on so you don't get splinters or accidentally pick up a bat. And also check your firewood to make sure you're not accidentally transporting somebody inside with it. So that was just a little bit of sort of how we classify them. But important thing to remember about our bats is their lives are changing profoundly with the seasons. So they're dealing with seasonal changes, and they're also dealing with, they're insectivores, so they need to be where the bugs are. And if the bugs aren't there, they have to have a strategy for how to deal with that. And that may mean that they're migrating south. Some species do. That may mean they're migrating into the central mid-Atlantic because we don't have really harsh winters, so they can wake up periodically. It may mean they're migrating to get to a cave in order to hibernate. So all these strategies that they're using are going to involve some kind of movement over the landscape. And this happens all year round, because if a young bat picks a place that's not working, they're going to get up and move and go find someplace that is going to work. So we don't see them as often during the winter because they are usually, they'll stay torpid, some of them for a while, and then sometimes they'll wake up when we have a warm up. So they're less active, but that doesn't mean they're not there. And go out really cold, when we have a cold snap like this, when it breaks, go out at about 4 o'clock when the sun's kind of dropping down, and look. You might see bats out because they often will come out and take advantage of winter moths and go get a drink of water. So it's actually a great time to be bat watching because it's light enough to see them. So as you move into the winter, and now the insects are by and large gone, water may be frozen. Bats are still busy though, the males are. So late summer through fall and into winter, this is when the males are, when bats are mating. And it's kind of an interesting strategy because they're mating in the fall and winter, and the males are expending all their energy because they're out there showing off or flying around or going in swarms in front of caves, and maybe then going down farther south to the next cave where people are still awake, join the next party down there. So they're very busy. And we do see males sometimes as winter progresses showing up really thin and like they probably burned off all their resources and then there's nothing there for them to eat. So it's a risky time for males. But because we do have this diversity of species, again, diversity of strategies. So our cave-dependent bats do this swarm where they sort of congregate in front of a hibernaculum opening, which could be a cave or a mine or something like that, and they just kind of have a meet and greet. And the males and females might mate. The females are showing the young of the year where to hibernate. There's some in and out of these caves. The females go in, settle into hibernation. And again, the males may either join them or keep moving south and go to a different swarm. We have our big brown bat, which is a resident bat. And that guy, I've seen a fair number of them just sort of hanging out in open areas. There's nothing wrong with them. I suspect there's some sort of I don't know whether they're resting or whether there's like an advantage they're showing off or what they're doing, but I've been called in several times to move these bats who just are in a place where they could be encountered by the public. So I convinced them to go someplace else. But it is, I don't know, it's just kind of comical, these guys hanging out like that. But it turns out that they're flying around singing, for want of a better word, love songs. Now that our acoustics have caught up with what bats are doing out there, people who study the acoustics of bats and are doing a lot of ID through, learning different characteristics of bat calls. Well, now they're seeing the calls aren't all hunting, seeking calls, that there are some other communication signals going on in there. And it looks like there's such a seasonal aspect to these particular calls they're picking up from big brown bats that they do think that there's sort of a mating call going on, which I think is really neat, because it wasn't until we could see sonograms of what bats are doing that we knew that, we're learning that they're doing this. So it's actually some of those things that are like bats are still being discovered. Like, people think we know bats, but we don't know bats because they're doing stuff that we just weren't aware of. And now our technology is getting better to discover more. And then my favorite fall event is, it never fails. I get a call. Someone says, oh, these two bats just came down right in front of me, and it's a mom and a baby because one's really little. It's like, no, if that's happening this time of year, they're invariably a mating pair of red bats. Why they crashed to the ground, I don't know, but apparently they mate on the wing. I suspect that the female is just really trying to get rid of that guy. But yeah, it's just this amazing thing. It happens a lot. I've had people send me photos of like bats on the deck of a boat, bats that crashed on the road right in front of them and they stopped. And yeah, it's crazy, but it happens. So if you see two bats crashing to the ground, it is not a mom and a baby in the fall. So very exciting time in the life of bat. And then we go into winter, deep winter. And so again, they've either migrated out and gone south, they're in a hibernaculum where they're going to spend the winter and survive on stored fat. Migrants may be still moving through the area, getting to down south, farther south where insects are available. And then our residents, or even the migrants who are going to settle in our region, often go into these sort of short bouts of torpor. So they might be, quote unquote, hibernating for a week or two, and then waking up during those warm snaps again to get a drink of water, to move, to hunt if there are insects available. So a lot of different strategies are being used to deal with this temperate climate, temperate climate. So one thing to bear in mind, though, is, again, if we have bats, say, that are spending their summer out on the coastal plain and they're hibernating in the karst in Rockbridge, they have to get there somehow and they have to get back, and that is migration. So we tend not to think of bats as being migratory, but any animal that's changing where it lives on a seasonal basis is migrating. So bats are migrating. And the ones that are moving north-south and even from lower to higher elevations are going right in the same migratory paths that birds use. So there are bats out off the coast, migrating on the Atlantic Coast Flyway. We've got the flyway they're using down along the Appalachians. So these guys are moving, and they're moving the same way birds are moving, maybe for shorter distances, but still moving. So now they've made it through the winter, and now it's spring, and that's when the pregnancies start. So they've made it in the fall. The females have stored the fertilized ova for our bats. This isn't there. There are other strategies. Some of them store sperm, but our bats store fertilized ova. And if the conditions are right on spring return or arousal from hibernation, that's when gestation starts. And the length of gestation is determined by availability of food and temperature. So it's like people say, well, how long is our gestation? I mean, there's a range for each species, but it seems to be, it can be variable. And then the pups are born, for me, I always say the first week of June is like, I am on high alert, because that's when the phone starts ringing. So that starts with our myotis, our little browns and those guys, and then big browns, late May, early June, and then red bats a little bit later, tricolors a little bit later still. But it seems like everybody is done pupping some point in June. And then the pups, in the space of 6 to 8 weeks, are full-sized and flying. They may not be flying well. They may not be flying well enough to stay out of trouble, but they have a really fast growth rate because they have to, because they need to be able to be bats and do what they're supposed to do and get fat and be ready for their first winter in that short window of time. But this delayed implantation of fertilized ova gives them that much longer that they have. They gives them probably about a month of extra time. So kind of a neat strategy. So here, bat pups are big. They can be, for some, not here, but other species elsewhere, can be up to 40% of the mother's body weight at birth, and ours generally are about 25%. So on the left, you've got a radiograph of a pregnant hoary bat, and you can just see how big that's fairly late stage pregnancy. And then on the right, she's actually bathing her pup that was just born. So we were lucky enough to get that video. You can see the umbilicus is still attached there. So that is a brand new baby pup. It's a pup. It's a bat baby or a pup. Technically, we call them pups. But anyway, so brand new, really rarely seen sight. So the pups are now, now we're late summer and moving back into fall. A ton of insects out there. The colonies are dispersing. The pups are old enough to move out on their own. They probably are still staying close to mom for as long as they can. But everybody needs to get fat now. Everybody, males, females, young of the year, everybody is trying to get fat. They're moving out. And so you have what we call naive bats. These are young of the year. They're out on the landscape. And what's interesting about bat rabies, because everybody wants to know about bat rabies, is that there's an increase in rabies in late summer in bats. And that has to do with the fact that these young are out there moving around on the landscape and encountering new bats. And so that's when there is a spike, and it's a documented spike in the transmission of rabies in bats. So rabies is real. It's out there. Bats are a vector. So one thing to remember is just leave them alone and let them do their thing, and we're all fine. But as we move into, again, now we're getting into late summer, fall, everybody's moving toward hibernacula if they're hibernators that use hibernacula. And our migrators are going to start moving toward wherever they're heading for the winter. This photo that you're looking at here is taken in Back Bay. and we were actually wandering around in Back Bay, as one does, and dodging cottonmouths because there's a ton of them there, and we were actually out there to take. We were photographing mostly birds, but the cottonmouths are there, so you might as well take bunches of pictures of them. And so my husband was hunkered down photographing this snake, and I was, it's not very exciting watching someone else take a photograph of a snake that's not doing anything. And so I looked up and I was like, what's that in that tree over there? And so as I got closer, I was like, it's fuzzy. And sure enough, it was a silver-haired bat. This photo was taken in October. So one of our migrants doing its thing, and it actually is hard, of course it's a photograph, it's focused in on the bat that's in the photograph, but it was remarkable how well camouflaged that animal was on that cypress with the lichen. And yes, I did move a cypress branch out of the way to get a clearer shot, but this is what those guys are adapted to do, is just to hang out and rest while they're migrating. So anyway, beautiful photograph, beautiful bat, and beautiful setting. And then my husband looked down and he was about 6 inches away from cottonmouth. So we love cottonmouths because, they don't do anything to you. But anyway, that was our Back Bay adventure. So I want to talk about fuel. If you're running around trying to get fat, you need to eat a lot. And if you're migrating, you need that much more. If you're hibernating, you need to put on a lot of fat in order to get through the winter. And that's all done with fuel. With very few exceptions, North American bats are insectivores. They eat insects. Insects are a low carber's dream. They are fat and chitin. There's no sugar in insects. They are a really, just a nice little fat bomb. We do have these pollinating species, and they are in the desert Southwest, and they're associated with columnar cactus. Nectar is kind of the opposite. It's a high carb dream. It's high in sugars. So that's just a different strategy that nectarivores use. We don't have enough enough flowers that nectar all year to sustain bats that do anything but, eat insects and nectar. You can't put on enough fat in order to build up those fat stores for hibernation. So no pollinators here. I hear a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, we need the bats because they're pollinators. Not in Virginia. We need the bats because they eat bugs in Virginia. I do want to point out the guy on the left is actually a pallid bat, and that's an omnivorous bat. That one can eat scorpions and centipedes and giant insects, and also nectar and pollinate. So a cool bat, but not here. This is an insectivore in action. This is Aaron Corcoran's lab. Super slow motion, infrared video here. The bat can't see, the insects can't see. That bat's using echolocation to target those insects. There's a lot of aerobatics going on there. And you can see it's difficult to catch an insect flying around at night. I'd like to remind everyone, good students of natural history should know predators miss more often than they're successful. So there's another energy sink right there. Look at that guy flying on its back and then takes off with the insect. So they're incredibly agile flyers, which they have to be because they're chasing insects. And they're using echolocation to detect them. Echolocation is ultrasonic because the sound wave has to bounce off the target. If the target's small, that forces a tighter sound wave, so it bounces and doesn't overwhelm. So that's why the bat calls are ultrasonic, because it's bouncing off of insects. It can be used for a lot of other things. It's used for navigation, but It's a very high frequency call. And if you look at the sonogram on the bottom, you have the kilohertz scale, megahertz, kilohertz. It's too small, can't tell what it is. But anyway, humans can hear up until about here-ish, really good hearing. We can go up to 20. Bats are operating all the way up here. So that is well above our range of hearing. But it's a tight sound wave, so it attenuates quickly in air. So they are literally shouting. So if you can imagine running as fast as you can while shouting at the top of your lungs, that's another high energy thing. So flight is energetically expensive and echolocation is energetically expensive. And even though they are sort of hardwired to do it, they have a long learning curve because they have to learn how to match the speed of their own flight to whatever the target is. So you will see young bats just completely whiff every so often. But once they get it, they're really good at it. So you've heard me talk about energetics a lot because it's important. These guys are little, so they already have a high metabolism. They're little furnaces flying around. A lactating female, that's like lactation is the most energetically expensive thing a mammal does. So she's trying to feed 1 or 2 babies, pups, in a very short amount of time. She's flying around catching insects in order to do that, and she's using echolocation. So you can just imagine these guys are just little sucking down fuel as much as they can. So if a lactating female can eat her own body weight in insects every night. So just kind of a cool thing to know about them. But that also means that it doesn't take much to send them spiraling down. And so they use torpor during the day to conserve energy, but lactating females can't because the pups have to stay warm, so they don't use nearly as much torpor as males and non-reproductive bats do. So bat moms are working hard. So they wake up dehydrated because of their metabolisms, and they rely on the health of their wing membranes to help them maintain body water. So they need to be able to drink, and they need flat, still, open water to do that. So here's this little red bat just coming in with her mouth wide open and just sort of scooping water as she goes. They also can lap as they're skimming over the water. As you can imagine, there's also a learning curve to figuring out how to do this. So imagine being a young bat and you've got to figure out how to just skim the water so you can drink. So if you're trying that in a swimming pool and you go in, bats can swim just fine, but they can't get out of a swimming pool, out of the slick side. So if you have a pool, please check your skimmers, and please put in, it's called a frog log. It helps wildlife get out of pools. So if you have anything where you're finding wildlife sort of stuck, get them some way to get out. But in general, our bats are in trouble. We have 17-ish species, depending on where you're standing, and about half of them are listed either state or federal. The northern long-eared bat, it was listed as federally threatened some time ago. It's now being upgraded to full endangered species status. The tricolored bat has been state endangered for a few years, and just September of this year, it was proposed for full endangered species listing. Little brown bat's under review for full endangered species listing. It is state listed as an endangered species. And then all the rest of them, which are, So we have a bunch of endangered bats in Virginia. And none of these are well known, but anybody who's looking at excluding bats or who's out there whacking bats because they don't like them, try and talk them out of that behavior, because our bats are in serious trouble now. So what's going on? Why are they in trouble? Now we get to the conservation bit, now that you know what they are and how hard their little lives are. Obviously, habitat loss. And hopefully I don't have to explain a lot about that. Habitat loss is habitat loss. So it causes profound changes. And bats are they're forest animals. They need tree canopy, they need forest structure. You do see hunting over open fields, but they need the protection of tree cover and forest as part of their landscape. They're seeing big changes in insect guilds as we lose our native hardwoods and our shrubs and all those sorts of things. And obviously, you know, as you lose forest cover, your waterways start to change. You see increases in water temperature and, you know, just there's this cascading effect for habitat loss and change. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is Virginia has really good cave conservancy laws, really great people who work in that arena. They try their best to work with private landowners to keep caves healthy and the habitat intact, but you can't control what private people do on their own land. So there are some issues with private cave management that can be having an impact on bats. This is much bigger than people tend to think about, human conflict. So we've got a public health community that rightfully is very concerned about bats and rabies, but it's so well entrenched that for a long time, any bat that was called into animal control was just summarily euthanized because it might have rabies. And anytime bats are in a home, the argument is you gotta get them out, you gotta get them out right now, they're gonna give somebody rabies. So what we have an industry of people who are out there removing bats from homes because that's the safe thing to do with little concern about the season and what the actual risk is. So luckily things are changing and we have a lot of folks in public health who are starting to say, well, wait a minute. Obviously, not every bat is rabid, and a bat that's never been anywhere near a human does not need to be euthanized and tested for rabies. So what we're really talking about is bats that are in living quarters with people and that could have contact with people. The conflict is that the bats that are in living quarters, mostly in summer, are maternity colonies. So that's when the young are there. And if you boot them out in June, the moms can go, but the babies are left behind. And so there is a loss of bats by doing this. So there needs to be a lot of work on convincing homeowners and the nuisance pest control people that the proper thing to do is to secure living quarters so these bats can finish out their reproductive season and then do the exclusion and put up some mitigation so you don't lose those bats entirely. And then you have, you know, DIY people who are getting rid of the bats by spraying them or squirting them, or so a lot of that can be just education helps with that. But there needs to be a little more teeth in our bat protection laws to help these structure dwelling bats. I already mentioned misuse of caves, but you know, if there's a cave closure and it's gated, it's crazy how much energy people will put into removing bat gates so they can go in the cave. So just reminding people that those gates are there for a reason. They're protecting hibernating populations, and sometimes they're protecting maternity colonies of the species that use caves. And then fear. The fear of rabies is, I mean, it's overwhelming for some people, just how scared they are of contracting rabies because they've been taught that a bat can give you rabies by just being in your presence. And that's just not true. Bats are very small. They don't attack people. I mean, if a bat flies on you and bites you, I'll tell you that one's rabid. But you know, bats don't fly on people and bite you. You know, looking at a bat is not going to give you rabies. Being 3 feet from a bat cannot give you rabies. So people understanding how rabies is transmitted and not listening to the media. And here's a brilliant example. My local TV station reported, and I think this was in Roanoke, actually, where this happened. They tested 3 skunks that were rabid. The image that accompanied that report was a fruit bat. It had nothing to do with bats, but the image, whenever rabies is discussed, will be of a bat. So I caution you, pay attention to these sort of subliminal things that are going on that do convince people that bats are the source of rabies. So a little more about rabies, so you're well armed as you go forward. There are no such things as bats that just transmit rabies. If a bat gets rabies and gets sick with it to a point where it can transmit it, that bat is going to die. It is fatal to bats. It is transmitted primarily by bites, so you have to be bitten by a bat. Despite what you read on the internet, if you are awake and aware and a bat bites you, you know it because they're not giving you a cute little love nip. They are biting you to make you go away, you giant predator. They are biting to defend themselves. So it is not a little, and it's not true that their teeth are so small you can't feel it. I felt it. So yeah, now if you're asleep, we take an abundance of caution because we don't know if you drank a 12-pack. We don't know if you're taking sleep aids. And we also are careful around children because they can't reliably rule out a bite to themselves or anyone who's mentally incapacitated. So please remember that the way you protect yourself from rabies is to not stick your fingers in some animal's face. Don't get bitten. Few other things, flying during the day, not unusual. They get up in the middle of the day to pee or get a drink of water. Same reason you get up in the middle of the night. They do have clinical symptoms when they're in late stage rabies. We don't expect other people to know what they are, but it's not the case that a perfectly healthy, normal bat flying around is out because it has rabies. Like I already mentioned, that seasonal spike we see. We do know that because rabies is endemic in the population, some of these animals can seroconvert and actually develop antibodies and never develop the disease. And that's because it's a disease that's in their population and they have to learn, somehow the population has to deal with it. If there was no ability for bats to seroconvert and develop antibodies, we wouldn't have bats because rabies is a fatal disease. So just keep these things in mind when people start spinning up about rabies, because this fear drives an awful lot of destruction of bats. So don't kiss them, don't lick them, don't hug them. They don't want it anyway. So leave them be and, think about it if you do find them in your own personal structures, how you want to deal with maybe helping those moms finish up raising the pups before you give them the boot. Pesticides, bats are bioaccumulators, so pesticides build up in them and then it can be expressed in breast milk. We know that there are issues. It's really hard to test animals for toxicities like this, but they are known bioaccumulators. Glue boards, we're having a big problem with people slapping down glue boards. They catch everything. These pictures of small hawks stuck on glue boards. This is not an appropriate method of pest control. These things should be outlawed. I don't know why they're, a couple stores have stopped, some stores have stopped carrying them, but not nearly enough. In Virginia, they're allowed to sell snake glue. They're marketed and labeled for use as snake glue boards. And you're not allowed to kill snakes in Virginia unless it's, an immediate threat. So it doesn't even make any sense to me why these things are out there. And then we have Superfund sites in Virginia that they're testing bats and they are finding that they are accumulating heavy metals. So, there's a lot of toxicity and some bycatch issues going on with bats, as well as an awful lot of other things. And then we have these charming urban wildlife species that we all love, our funny raccoons and our, gazillions of gray squirrels everywhere. Well, our way of living favors these animals. It doesn't favor things like bats. So bats are probably using subpar roost sites, which are giving access to things like raccoons, crows. And, gray squirrels are not entirely vegetarian. They will eat small mammals and chipmunks as well. So it is just something to think about, that maybe if we could just keep our habitats a little better balanced, that maybe bats would stand, they would be better protected. And then, talked about this a little bit earlier, things that should be helping and maybe aren't. So turbines are Cuisinarts for bats. They either fly directly into them and get badly injured, or they get caught in a low pressure pocket at the end of the vanes. The rotor swept area of some of these modern turbines, half a football field. These things are huge, and those vanes are moving the terminal speed about 220 miles an hour, maybe more as the technology gets better. There's no animal on Earth that is adapted to something moving that fast. Birds can see these, and they tend to fly higher. Bats, echolocation doesn't work on something that's moving that quickly and taking up that much area. So what you end up with is a lot of dead migrants. And so that's a hoary bat, one of our native migrants. There's this study came out in 2019. There's some other studies, Bat Conservation International is really involved in this, but they're positing the extinction of the hoary bat with the projected build out of wind turbines in, I think, 35 years. So these guys are heavily impacted. Just something to think about as you're thinking about your, choices you make for where your energy comes from and what kind of fights you want to get involved in. But yeah, siting issues for turbines, it's important, and people need to be thinking about it. And then we have good old, I hope I don't have to explain white nose syndrome to you guys. Hope everyone here has heard of it. But it is devastating our cave-dependent hibernators. 90% losses, and particularly our little brown bats. It's an invasive introduced fungus. So it came from someplace else, got into caves in the eastern United States, and is just decimating these bats. I watched a colony of 1,000 little brown bats disappear over the course of 4 years. Disappear, just gone. I worked with a family that had a historic house up in Shenandoah County. They had a colony of over 1,000 bats, gone, disappeared in a few years. That's what this is doing to our bats. It is not gone. It is here because those spores persist in the cave. So every bat that goes back in for the winter gets re-exposed to this thing. So we aren't seeing the high mortality anymore because there aren't that many bats left to die. So this is why we need people to stay out of caves. We need people to clean their gear if they've been in a cave. We need people to raise awareness. I still talk to people in this area who've never heard of white nose syndrome. This is in 38 states now and like 5 or 7 Canadian provinces. This is huge, and people haven't heard about it. And remember, these guys live a long time and they don't have a lot of babies, so their population cannot rebound in the face of this level of loss. So the summer population needs our help so that those young of the year stand a better chance of surviving, and then maybe some genetic defenses can be mounted against this thing. I just want to say, this is 2007, the cave where it turned up, and this is where we are today. So that is a massive expansion of a novel disease, for lack of another word to call it. It causes them to burn through their fat stores, and it drastically impacts their wing membranes, so they can't maintain water balance. Oh, wait, I'm gonna just go back for a second because I just want to point out that it hit Virginia, I want to say 2 years after it was first recognized. So that spread down the Appalachians was really rapid. And what it did do was allow us to understand how far these bats are moving. So they really are migratory. And I really want people to remember that. I mean, the bats that you see behind your shutter in summer, I mean, they may only be migrating a little ways, but they're going someplace else for the winter. So these guys are moving, and they need to be protected at both ends of their seasonal travels. So there's some other fun stuff coming up. We've got the insect apocalypse. There's some studies coming out of Europe showing that insect populations are plummeting. And you can say, oh, well, that's a great thing because, yay, better for our fruits and vegetables or whatever, but probably not. Insects are the base of the food chain for lots of things. So this is of concern. They think light levels are having what are a big factor, and of course, the pesticide use for agricultural crops. And then we have, this is a very little known thing, but it happens, the dead bat trade. You can go on Etsy and buy yourself a taxidermied bat under glass, just like you can a beetle or a butterfly. And this board science, you can buy enough dead bats and some kind of preservative for your entire school to play with a dead bat. And those are native North American species. And their site says that it's ethical because it's not an endangered species. So I want to say that, if you come across this, if you know a teacher or a school that's doing this, you might want to reach out and say, is this really the best way we can teach our children how to appreciate bats? Because I argue it is not. And if you know somebody's got a bat hanging on a wall, they have no idea where it came from and what it might be carrying. So, it's just a nasty little trade that people tend not to think about because you don't see it. But I guarantee you can go on, you can buy a dead bat if you really want to. Please don't support that. And then we have our favorite, good old climate change. So we are seeing, changes in insect guilds and availability. Things are getting out of phase. Mom bats may not have the insects they need when they need them to keep the pups healthy. There's some argument that, climate change is affecting the ability of invasive plants to gain a foothold. Invasive plants obviously are an issue, and there's some work being done looking at lack of nutrition and, of course, non-native invasives, especially if they're doing well because of climate change or supporting a host of non-native insects that may not have a predator. They may not be contributing to the food base for our native animals. So this is the image I have here is of a freetail who came into our care. We are starting to see freetails moving into the area. So there's a range expansion going on, probably driven by climate change. So, climate change is just such a profound issue for everything. And it's a little overwhelming to think about, what's down the pike for us as well as our wildlife. So why should we care about the bats? I'm sure I don't need to say this to you all, but we should care about them because they're super cool and we have 17 species of them and they're fascinating and they're smart and they have high social intelligence and they're amazing to watch at night. But if you have to get practical about it, it's because of the pest control services they provide. They're protecting our parks, they're protecting our forests, they're protecting our timber industry, they're protecting our agricultural crops. So you see this number 3.7 billion annually for contributed to U.S. agriculture. And then some people are saying that may be as much as $57 billion a year to the U.S. in pest control services. Those are huge numbers. So if you need to convince people that bats are cool, and I have this little cartoon here because if you go to our Vimeo channel, which is called Bats Aren't Scary, we have a series of these cartoons to help people understand in very cute ways, and kids love them, what bats are doing and how we can help address making the world more bat friendly. So what can we do? Share the love, please speak up. Just tell people they're not flying around spitting rabies. That they're under, a lot of pressure and that we need them. They need us to help them. If you are a landowner and you've got habitat, please reach out to your conservation, whoever you're working with, whether it's extension or forest or whatever, and, get those conservation. There's lots of assistance out there. So, help protect your shelter woods, do whatever you can to keep them standing. If there's something available to help you manage invasives, do it. And then I want to, bat boxes. We can do more for bats than stick up a bunch of wooden things that they don't even use in the first place. So you do not need to slap up a bat box and say, oh, I'm helping the bats. If you have bats and you need them out of your attic, sure, do a bat box. They will not preferentially move into a bat box if they have a roost that's working for them. So please don't put all your money and your time into bat boxes. If you want to, and you want to do an experimental thing to see which ones they like better, and then you want to share that information, yes, do that. But please don't think that putting up a bat box is going to get you bats and that those bats are going to eat all your mosquitoes, because that's not how it works. But plenty of other ways to help. There's habitat help, any kind of mitigation you can do with land, appropriate land use. And then you guys are probably already involved in some citizen science projects, but work with partner organizations. We all have greater reach if we're working together. And please don't forget your local wildlife rehabilitators who are out there usually paying for what they do out of their own pockets. We don't get any state or federal support. So if you can transport or want to help one way or another, rehabbers could really use your help. And do your best. That's all we can all do, but please do your best. And the bats they really need our help. So to end on a happier note, the wind industry is working with conservation organizations. Their states are instituting sighting requirements and cut-in speed, so that when the vanes on the turbines start to turn, it's not at a time when bats are likely to be most active. Public perception of bats has changed immensely. So we had COVID and everybody said, oh, I bet people are really mad about the bats. And honestly, I didn't hear much of that at all. People seem to understand that it was people giving people COVID. So there has been a huge change in perceptions of bats, and that's thanks to Bat Conservation International, in the UK, Bat Conservation Trust, all this little grassroots people who are out here running around telling you how great they are. It's working. And then I mentioned this earlier, but animal services are starting to, understand that, you don't have to euthanize every bat you come across. Some exclusion services, the pest management people are starting to be like, yeah, we just don't do bats in summer. So that's good. That's a start. There are still plenty out there who are lying to people about what's going on in their attics. So if you're in that situation, shop wisely. Tons of information from the public and getting involved in citizen science and doing cool habitat things. And in the Northeast, where white nose first hit, there are survivors, and they're starting to see small increases in bat populations. So there's a glimmer of hope on the horizon that the bats may be starting to mount a defense of their own against white nose syndrome. So all that's really good news. So please keep carrying all that forward, and let's do what we can to keep our poor bats going. So yes, I'm going to take questions, but I do want to say at the end of this presentation, and I can screenshot this and send it or whatever, but there are resources in here for you to go, learn more, go further into this, find more information about some of the stuff I've talked about. So I'll figure out how to make that available to you guys. But before I start taking questions, what I'm going to do is switch my camera over, because while you ask your questions, we have a bat for you to see. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you should be able to see this little white net thing here. And please jump in with questions, Barbara, if you've got them there.
Okay, I will. But you jump in when you want to say something about our visitor here, okay?
Sure.
So here's somebody who asks if bats are known to eat spotted lanternfly And might they be a help with some of our invasive pest insects?
So I don't know. I don't know. I think spotted lanternfly is new enough. My theory is anything that's black and red and white spotted uh, is probably colored that way because it doesn't taste very good. So I don't know, and I don't know what their native predators are. That would be an interesting question. So I don't know. I do know that bats will not touch brown marmorated stink bugs.
Oh,
They stink. They'll eat native stink bugs just fine, but apparently not those brown other stinky ones. Yeah, I'm trying to wake up Hazelnut here.
oh. So somebody asks, and this might be related to your advice about bat boxes. Somebody asked, is it beneficial to build bat nests for them to in open areas at my farm? I would like to collect their manure to use for soil for plants, as well as getting to get rid of insects.
I think that's a great idea. And if you have land and have the ability to look up different designs and maybe set up, a series of bat boxes and then see what they like. If you get any takers, usually it takes 2 to 3 years. And while the output of bats is prodigious, you have to figure out some way to harvest it, because underneath my bat box, which is occupied because I have bats who get released here, I keep forgetting to put anything down and it just sort of melts into the substrate underneath. So it's very, it just breaks down in rain and sun. So you'll have to figure out a way to harvest it. But that sounds like a perfect setup for an experimental bat box installation.
Uh-huh.
All right, it's chilly in here, so Hazelnut is just like, I don't really want to. Let me see if I can. There we go.
Here we go. Oh my goodness.
So I'm going to turn on my bat detector for a second to see if he'll echolocate for us. So Hazelnut's an eastern red bat. He's not at all convinced this is a great idea. So, all right, wake up, buddy. Say something. Okay, he's not echolocating, but he's this year's model. Oh, did you see the yawn? He just got a great big yawn.
Oh yeah.
Now he's echolocating. Hear the clicking? Well, anyway, I have a bat detector running that allows you to hear the ultrasound, but it only works if the bat's actually. Did you see that yawn? He's really sleepy.
Poor guy.
So anyway, he's an eastern red bat, which is one of those foliage bats I was talking about earlier. He lives out in the would be living out in the trees, but he is actually he's a runt, so he can fly, but he can only fly about 3 feet off the ground, which is not conducive to survival. So he's with me, and he's one of our educational ambassadors. He actually hails from Lexington area.
Really?
Yeah, he's one of your locals.
So that's related to one of our questions. Who do we call for help with bats in Rockbridge County, which is where Lexington is?
So you can call me. I'm just up in Mount Solon, right up in Augusta, so I'm not too terribly far from you. And you're also about the same distance to the Wildlife Center. And I work closely with the Wildlife Center, and if a bat goes to them and it's in okay shape, I'm going to eventually see it. And if it comes to me and it's in okay shape, it stays. And if it's injured, it goes to them. So we work really closely together. So we're your closest resources. And then Southwest Wildlife Center in Roanoke can also take bats. So you've got some help within striking distance.
Oh, that's great. So in the chat, somebody has asked if one needs to repair or rebuild a deteriorated structure, like a barn or garage in which bats are living, what is the best time of year to do so in order to avoid the negative effects on bats?
That is an excellent question, and thank you for thinking about it. So if you know your colony that's a resident, then you get a sense of when they leave, and I would say generally around here, November, late September, late October and November is pretty safe. Our big browns can be very persistent, and like this warm spell we had, I guarantee you some are probably still hanging around, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, it's cold. But on a normal year, they're usually moved out in late fall, and you've got the whole winter. They tend to start coming back in April.
Where do they go?
Depends on the species. So a red bat like this might stay in the area, but it wouldn't be using a barn. Our barn colonies tend to be those colonial bats, and what they're looking for is a warm, protected place to encourage rapid growth of the young. So they're going to be up there along the ridge line where it's like 120 degrees, or on the wall where it's 90. So they move out as soon as the temperatures start to drop and those pups are old enough to, follow the mothers, and to, there's still enough insects out that'll fuel their wherever they're going to go. So I'm going to shift Hazelnut for just a second because I want to get him a snack. Which is easier said than done because bats are like Velcro. He was really really attached to my glove there. So he actually loves this cat treat that's like you give to your, are you gonna take it? Maybe? Oh, there we go. Will you? Oh yes, that's delicious.
Ooh.
What is that?
So
It's
we have another question for you. Are there any plants or gardening things you can do in your home garden to replicate bats' natural habitat or to help support bats in some way?
Natives. Plant a lot of natives, because if you've got, especially a native shrub story, you've got the insects that the bats need. You've got the proper nutrition for the insects. And then if you've got native hardwoods, you've got, probably some tree hollows and some sloughing bark, and you've got clumps of leaves for your tree dwellers. So yeah, try to do as much native as you can. I know that, we like aesthetics. So I'm not a hardcore only natives kind of person, but if you can give a substantial part of your plantings over to native plants, you're really making a huge difference. So if you got another question, I'm going to actually swap Hazelnut. I'm trying to get him to get that last drop there. I'm going to swap him out and get a different bat. So, okay, before I put him away, because he's still got stuff stuck to his nose, but you can see him kind of looking around and everything. Notice that he's reddish with white points there. That's part of his camouflage for existing in a tree. He's very fuzzy all the way down, and even to his feet are fuzzy. And that helps because he lives out in the foliage and doesn't have a protected roost. Well, he does here, but so those are some of the characteristics of tree bats. And I'm sorry, I just have to get that off his chin. He's also got a little bit of tipping on his fur that helps with camouflage. I don't know if you just saw him moving his wings around, but his fingers are actually folded up inside the inside of his forearm. So what you're looking at is elbow to wrist. So that's the arm structure, part of the arm structure of the wing there. I don't pull their wings out to show people because I just think it's rude. And some bats will put up with it. This one will, oh, there you go. He's rearranging again. But yeah, he does not put up with that nonsense. So, but anyway, so there's a typical tree bat. So I'm going to put him up here in his little temporary, he doesn't live in this tent. That's just what we use for moving them around. And if you have another question, I can answer while I go to get our other bat.
Yes, you mentioned the natural bridge study population. Is that in Rockbridge, and what's that all about?
That is run by VMI Biology. And they've been doing a population study on small-footed bats at Natural Bridge for I couldn't tell you how long. But when we got that small-footed, we got to work with Dr. Mooseman, who's one of the profs involved in the project. And now you have the sum total of my knowledge of what that project is.
If there's somebody on the meeting who would like to add to that answer, just say something in the chat and I'll call on you. And then you mentioned that free-tail bats are moving into the Northeast. And is that a climate change related expansion of territory? And what do they eat? And might they be eating different things than our current native bats?
Really good question about their diets. Yes, they're probably eating somewhat of a different insect guild. I don't know that much about them because they are new to the region. They are moving up river valleys. So University of Tennessee, Knoxville was doing some work on looking at the range expansion of them. Hang on, Curly moved again. Curly, where did you go? You can keep asking questions. I can hear you.
Okay. I had experience with finding bats at the peak of my roof, in the vent at the end of the attic, and I was pretty happy about that. But then I had squirrels move into the attic too, and so I turned on some lights up there, thinking that maybe the squirrels wouldn't like it brightly lit all day and all night. But then I didn't see the bats. Did I inadvertently chase the bats away by turning on lights?
Probably, but it's, I tell you, you're far better off moving the squirrels out because they chew holes in your house, which lets even more bats in. So I highly recommend getting the squirrels out, and bats at the end louvers, if they're on the outside of the vents of the screening, are really not that big of a problem. So maybe they'll come back now that the squirrels are gone. Sorry, this is taking a minute because I found the wayward bat. And apparently he was having dinner, so he's not real happy with me at the moment. But let's see if we can throw some light on the subject here. And this is a big brown bat. That's probably what was living in your end unit, in your louvers. These guys love louvers. Let me get him a little closer.
Oh my gosh.
So he weighs about 15 to 18 grams, and a red bat, he's like, no, I was eating. You're so rude. Here, let me get there.
What did you just feed him?
A mealworm. But his dinner dish is about half empty, and there were chewed up mealworms all over the floor when I just went to get him. So I think that was, are you gonna have another one? No. All right. For him, I'm gonna turn on the bat detector. Sorry, the camera is really having a hard time getting enough light on him. Let me see if I can light him up a little bit more by moving. There we go. How's that? Better. All right, Curly, talk.
So will bats eat bugs that aren't flying?
They have to learn. They don't know that. So when they come in to rehabilitation or captivity for any reason, they don't know that non-flying food is food. So they go through a learning curve. Curly actually was raised here, so he's a pro at it. The young, of course, it's easier to teach them than the ones who've already been out on the landscape and know that food flies. But the young learn pretty quickly. And like I said, Curly's a pro.
So what is their vision like? They do have eyes. Can they
Yeah.
see it?
They see just as well as we do, probably similarly in low light. So echolocation is what they use to capture insects with. In order to use eyes at night, eyes work on light. So they would have to have eyes that are bigger than their heads to catch flying bugs at night. So echolocation does that for them. But as far they do navigate by sight, they clearly can see things because they look right at things. So, but yeah, it's similar to ours. They probably I don't think they see color. Fruit bats and the old world fruit bats do, but our microbats don't have the color apparatus, which right now I forget if it's rods or cones or what, but they don't have it.
Here's another question for you. Do any of Virginia's bats eat fruit like native persimmon or pawpaw?
No. So they are strict insectivores. And frugivory, again, we get back to that where you've got a really high sugar food. So if you need to think about getting through a winter, either migrating out or using your stored body fat in order to hibernate, fruit won't get you there. So now if you're in the tropics or in even subtropical areas where there's fruit available all year long, sure, you're going to have a lot of frugivores in those regions. But for us, because we're temperate, the fruit isn't available and it wouldn't give enough nutrition to get them through those times when no insects are available. A good question, because there's an old myth that red bats eat peaches, and they don't.
So we're about out of time, but I've got one more question and a comment I'd like to sneak in here. Somebody asked, is there somewhere to send a photo of a bat to get an ID?
Yes, I love playing Guess the Bat. Please send it to me. You can text it. Our number is public, but it's 703-973-3157. Text me your photos. Tell me why just say, hey, can you tell me what this bat is? And I will do my best. And if I can't figure it out, I will help you find somebody else who can.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
It's one of my favorite things to do in downtime is to look at bat photos and figure out what they are.
So I have one comment that I'll conclude the questions with. There have been several other comments just saying how fascinating and what a wonderful presentation this has been. And this is somebody who wrote in to say, we are not professionals connected to ecological concerns, but residents of Rockbridge County who'd like to know more about our bat populations and how we can support them. There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew.
Yeah, man. That's great. And that's so true. So, everybody mind your gardens, mind your outdoor lights, all of us working together to do our little part to keep our little piece of the earth green is the best we can all do, and probably the most effective thing on a local level we can all do is work together and just hold those principles.
Yeah, I appreciate your presentation. It was very good. As predicted, I know more now than I did an hour.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And I'm so thrilled to know that so many people show up to learn things from your organization. That's great.
Well, thank you. This has been terrific. And just for the people who are in the audience, this has been recorded, and as soon as we can, we'll get it up on our website. We will also have a copy of Leslie's slides there. So if you want to go back and look at those links to resources, you'll be able to find them that way.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.